Getting around New Zealand has never been easy. The country is encircled and divided by some of the roughest water in the world. To cross Cook Strait today calls for less courage than it used to, but it still pays to pick your weather carefully if you can. The first settlers to sail through Wellington Heads, they weren't put off by either the southerlies or the swell. They'd crossed the world to get here, and they were determined to make a go of it no matter what the obstacles. And here in Wellington, nature herself provided obstacles enough. Inside Port Nicholson, the hills shelter the sea, but they also lock the city in. The whole idea of siting a communications centre here seems absurd. The ferry terminal has been built on an earthquake fault line. What's more, the only railway and the only motorway in and out of the capital run along the same fault. Here in Wellington, the main trunk line today rests on shaky ground indeed. The Maori never tried to challenge nature. Instead, he saw himself as part of it, and he played out his role within it. He used canoes on rivers, on lakes, on estuaries, and on sheltered coastal waters. Large canoes had brought him to New Zealand, but here he paddled smaller craft which were easier to carry, not only from river to river, but even from one ocean to another. This is the other main part of the Maori system of transport, the firm, hard sand of the beach, which they followed for miles and miles on foot. Two elements then made up the Maori's main trunk line: the sand of the beach and the water for their canoes. And that main trunk line linked three key centres of population and activity. And it's surprising how they correspond to three of the four main centres on our own main trunk line today. Tamaki here was the Maori's most important crossroads and centre of population. And from there, the main trunk line followed the Waikato River deep into the interior of the North Island, and from there across to the west coast, either by the Wanganui River or by bush tracks where these were unavoidable. In any case, all along the beach here, the route followed the sand as far as this point here where I am now. This is Kapiti Island, the second hub of population. And to the Maoris, it was the equivalent of Wellington, their stepping off point for the South Island. And around here at times must have been a real hive of activity as they left the land and took to the water in their canoes to cross the strait to the island. From Kapiti, the route continued by canoe across Cook Strait, and the Maoris travelled, of course, having considered the weather very, very carefully, heading for Kaikoura, and from Kaikoura by coastal track as far south as here at Kaiapohia, the modern Kaiapoi and the Maori equivalent, of course, of Christchurch. Kaiapohia was the southern terminal of the Maori main trunk line, because beyond that point in those days lived very, very few people indeed. Kaiapoi had special functions. It was an emporium of trade between North and South Islands, a point of exchange, and also a manufacturing centre. And all this for one very good reason. Kaiapohia was the nearest point on the main trunk line to nature's most precious gift to the Maori, greenstone. They called it Pounamu. The geologist calls it nephrite or jade. It was as hard as steel, and the Maori could polish it to a knife-like edge. From it, they made blades for axes and chisels. If Pounamu could cut down forest giants, it could crack skulls. So from it, they also made weapons of war. Polishing gave greenstone sharpness. It also brought out its delicate colors. So the Maori made precious ornaments from it, as beautiful as made by Stone Age man anywhere. Between Kaiapohia and the source of greenstone stood the greatest physical barrier in the country, the Southern Alps. Crossing these mountains to reach greenstone was the most formidable journey the Maori undertook. Finding and crossing the passes through the Alps tested the Maori's endurance and energy to the full. It was a journey that could be justified only by the inestimable value attached by all tribes to the Pounamu they were seeking. The parent rock from which Pounamu comes lies high in the alpine headwaters of the Arahura River Valley. But the principal source of the stone for the Maoris was the riverbed down below. The Maoris who came over the high passes from Kaiapohia 2 or 3 centuries ago were after small portable pieces of high quality, like these perhaps. They still had a long journey ahead of them, carting this stuff back over the ranges, so there was no point in taking waste material that was going to be thrown away. It was the same with all commodities of Maori trade, whether it was calabashes of preserved birds or baskets of dried fish or kits of kumara, made no difference. They all had to be capable of being carried by one man. But all this was to change. It changed, in fact, when sailing ships came up over the horizon, bringing a completely new pattern and dimension for New Zealand trade and transport. The majestic beauty of a sailing ship in full rig belies the rigours and risks faced by the men who sailed in them. The first sailing ships to come within sight of what he called this high-lying land were able Tasmans in 1642. Those were tiny vessels in today's terms, but to the Maoris they must have seemed enormous. Yet a century and a half later, when sealers and whalers were regularly off the coast, ships were 3 or 4 times larger still, and now they were here for keeps. And they brought the colonists, whose settlements grew up along the coast. The quicker the settlements grew, the more they depended on sailing ships. The flow of goods in and out quickly became their lifeblood. By 1850, quite separate colonies had been established from Otago to Auckland. Almost the only contact between them was by sailing ship, but the foreign ships which made the journeys were infrequent, and many were lost at sea. It wasn't long before the colonists constructed vessels of their own, the most distinctive of which were the scows. They were shallow draft, wide-bodied sailing vessels built from kauri and designed to carry heavy cargoes wherever there were 2 or 3 feet of water. Most of all, they were at home in the shallow estuaries and coastal inlets of the north. But during the early years of colonial settlement, the fastest and surest way of getting around was on foot. The fledgling colonial government in Auckland had to assert its authority over the leaders of the Wakefield settlements further south. The earlier Maori route from Tamaki to Cook Strait was the only certain way of delivering official instructions, messages and correspondence. From the mid-1840s, Maori runners provided a 3-weekly service. By then, the church had been active in New Zealand for 30 years. The missionaries had travelled further and knew the country better than any other Europeans. The wooden churches built by the settlers soon after they landed are amongst our earliest and most enduring landmarks. The man responsible for the simple yet beautiful design of most of them was George Augustus Selwyn. Selwyn was Bishop of New Zealand for 27 years. He was appointed from England in 1841 when he was only 32. He'd always been athletic and a good swimmer, which was just as well because only a few months after reaching Auckland, he set out on a tour of inspection of his far-flung diocese. Even for someone as important as the first Anglican Bishop of New Zealand, there was only one way of getting about this country 140 years ago, and that, of course, was on foot. He'd landed at Banks Peninsula in the distance here from Auckland, from a little schooner at a whaling station, and immediately decided to set off and walk to Otago, 300 kilometers, just like that. The journey was not a difficult one. Indeed, the young bishop, still athletic, enjoyed it. And after 7 days, his party reached here. It was early on a summer's evening when they reached, indeed, this very spot on the Waiho River, at the mouth of the Waiho River, with Waimate today just over here. Whilst Selwyn's Maoris were busy lighting a fire and pitching a tent and beginning to prepare the evening meal for him, he glanced across the river and saw, to his surprise, another party there. As they came across the river, Selwyn was surprised to see a European in the party. He was astonished to recognize that European as Dr. Edward Shortland, Commissioner of Aborigines, a member of the infant civil service of the colonial government, whom he knew in Auckland. That evening, the two Aucklanders had a meal together 1,100 kilometers away from their wives and families and their homes up in the north. Next morning, they were both off early. Selwyn still had 500 kilometers or so to travel southwards to Otago and back to Banks Peninsula, whilst Shortland, also on Shanks's pony, was heading north for Akaroa. These days, horses are expensive playthings. In New Zealand, there are no foxes to follow, so the hunt chases hares, and they can be hard enough to find. Pony clubs, gymkhanas, polo matches and race meetings, of course, provide the same kind of pleasure at the same sort of cost. Although horses haven't totally disappeared, there are now nowhere near as many as there were at the turn of the century, when there was one for every 2 people. Horses carried most of the freight and passenger traffic. They pulled anything on wheels. But our best-known, most romantic reminder of the age when the horse was supreme is the stagecoach. Like Air New Zealand's Boeing 737s, Carbon Coast coaches provided the express transport of the time. Just like aircraft, they carried passengers and only high-value small volume freight, especially the prospector's gold.
Tickets, please. Thank you.
Thank you.
Tickets, please.
The Iron Horse wasn't long coming to New Zealand. The first steam locomotive in New Zealand chugged along this very line as early as 1863. That was only 13 years after the Canterbury Pilgrims landed at Littleton from the first 4 ships. Canterbury in those earliest days was a settlement of trained and talented young men. Not only were they attracted by the theory of colonization, they were also eager to put it to practical test. Christchurch was the only settlement in New Zealand without direct access to the sea and to sailing ships. But there were no physical barriers between the town and the nearest estuary. The biggest obstacle was landing the first loco. The colonists called it, appropriately enough, the Pilgrim, and it was remarkably similar to the one the people of Christchurch still enjoy during weekends and holidays at Ferrymead. Ferrymead at that time was the port on the estuary where all the Canterbury settlement's cargoes came ashore from lighters. From lighters because the estuary was far too shallow for sailing ships. They tied up in the nearest deep water at Littleton. The old Madras Street station in Christchurch was the setting for opening day. The Pilgrim shuttled 3,550 proud and happy passengers backwards and forwards to Ferrymead. But the proudest man that day on the first trip rode up front on the footplate. His name was William Sefton Morehouse, and he was affectionately known as Railway Billy. His vision, courage and political skill not only signalled the start of railways in New Zealand, but put the province of Canterbury politically way out in front. Morehouse wasn't one of the most scholarly of Canterbury's bright young men. He was essentially a man of action who knew how to get things done. He first got himself elected to the post of Superintendent of Canterbury when he was only 32. He held the post for 8 of the next 10 years. It made him virtually provincial governor, prime minister and chief executive all in one. Among his first acts as superintendent was laying the foundation stone for what is the most remarkable landmark of the period in Christchurch, the Canterbury Provincial Council Chambers. This building is a very appropriate reminder of the contribution made by Morehouse, because Morehouse was, above all, a politician, and a good one into the bargain. He was very clever at handling the provincial council. When it suited his purpose, he was quite prepared to work democratically through that council. When, on the other hand, it didn't suit his purpose, he was certainly not averse to acting quite independently and maybe telling the councillors afterwards. But Morehouse was not, of course, simply a successful wheeler-dealer politician. This building also reminds us of his other most important quality, his vision. Many a colonial politician in his position would have found satisfaction enough in overseeing the construction of such an imposing building in such an unlikely spot. But Morehouse had already switched his imagination onto a totally different track. Morehouse could see that the new railway to Ferrymead only emphasized the barrier of the port hills. They still denied the city access to its deep-water port. 600 meters high, the hills are part of an extinct volcano whose last explosive eruption had created Littleton Harbour. To Morehouse, there was only one solution: to bore a tunnel beneath the volcano, direct to deep water. The physical difficulties were bad enough, but Morehouse soon found himself in political strife as well. This, which he occupied as superintendent of the province, became a really hot seat, especially when the man he'd replaced as superintendent returned all the way from London to wage war not only on the tunnel project, but on Morehouse as well. That man was James Edward Fitzgerald, a flamboyant dreamer and a politician with none of Morehouse's practical common sense. Fitzgerald even returned from London and set up the Christchurch press to oppose the tunnel project. Until the press appeared, Fitzgerald attacked Morehouse in the columns of the Littleton Times.
We should, once for all, take the public purse out of the hands of time-serving, log-rolling, speculating, popularity hunting, sad events compel me to add, utterly unprincipled superintendents.
But such extravagant attacks only strengthened Morehouse's conviction that the only answer was the tunnel. A provisional contract to drive the tunnel was negotiated with a London firm. It's basalt, all right. Solidified volcanic lava, and very hard. I'm in the Littleton Tunnel, and as you can see, this rock's so hard that after 110 years or more of use and excavation, there's been very little weathering of the face of it. The original contractors from England found it so hard that they wanted an extra £30,000 put onto their contract price, but William Sefton Morehouse wouldn't wear that. He was not the sort of man to be put off either by problems of this sort. He called on a young geologist, a young German geologist working at that time and earning a reputation in Nelson. His name was Julius von Haast. In a very short time, he provided Morehouse with a concise, competent, illustrated report, which Morehouse took with him to Melbourne. And in a few days, he was back in Christchurch, the superintendent, with a new contract, Australian contractors, and a contract price not in excess of the original one. They went to work employing local labor and with pick and shovel methods, there being no elaborate tunneling machinery in those days, such as has been employed more recently in this country on the Kaimai project in the Bay of Plenty. No imported labor like the Italians we imported for the Tongariro power scheme a few years ago. And when you think about it, this was a really tremendous undertaking because at that time, the combined populations of Littleton and Christchurch were no more than 3,000 people. The whole job was finished just before Christmas in December 1867. It had taken in all 6 years to complete, but now at last Christchurch and Littleton were firmly linked. The local people went mad, and in fact more than half the population of Christchurch went through here that day to picnic around Littleton Harbour. But for Railway Bill in Morehouse and for the South Island generally, this landmark had much greater significance. There was now no longer any barrier between the productivity of the Canterbury Plains and the port, and nothing now stood in the way of the South Island main trunk railway line extending all the way south from here. The Great Southern Railway had already started, but the opening of the tunnel spurred it on its way. Track unrolled like carpet across the Canterbury Plains. Tiny settlements which had grown up as staging posts became stations on the line. Only one thing slowed the smooth progression south, the vast spread of shingle and the braided channels of ice-fed rivers, the Rakaia, the Rangitata, the Waitaki. Across them, local contractors strung bridges a mile long. With the completion of this main trunk line, South Island ascendancy over the north was assured for the next 25 years. In the North Island, progress was slower and less predictable. In the 1880s, the tiny port of Awakino, north of New Plymouth, was looking forward to a busy future. But 100 years on, Awakino has hardly changed. Now that the port is dead, the day's biggest event is still the arrival of the coach, bringing mail from New Plymouth and Auckland. It's hard to imagine that this obscure backwater once had hopes of becoming a key station on a railway line linking Taranaki with Auckland. Yet for a while, in the 1880s, this was certainly on the cards. Awakino could have become another Timaru or Wanganui. A fierce battle had developed over which way the North Island main trunk line should go, and typically Parliament set up a select committee to report. And because the matter was so contentious, and because it affected so many North Island members, the House decided to appoint 7 South Islanders to constitute that select committee. It didn't take them long, though, to make up their minds. They listened not so much to the big business interests in Auckland and in Taranaki, but rather to the views of surveyors and engineers. I'm in the General Assembly Library, and this is a copy of the appendices to the journals of the House of Representatives for 1884. This is a map prepared by the Department of Public Works at the time. It shows the picture pretty well, I think. It was a matter of choosing one from 4 routes that had been surveyed. In the west here were 2 parallel routes, favoured by the big business interests in Auckland, who saw the opportunity of tying in Taranaki to their markets. The coastal route, so-called, went down the Awakino Valley and linked up with the Foxton-New Plymouth line at Waitara. The western route, as they called it, was through Ohura to Stratford. To the east here was a route favoured rather by the engineers. It followed up the Waikato Valley east of Lake Taupo and over to Hastings, where it tied in with the Wellington-Napier line. And through the centre of the country here, from Tiawamutu to Martin, was another available route through densely bush-clad country still firmly in the hands of the Maoris. This central route through undeveloped, virtually unknown territory is the one that Parliament finally selected. It had been explored the year before, 1883, by a highly competent but relatively unknown surveyor called John Rochford. Rochford was a mild-mannered man, but he also had extraordinary endurance. He was probably the toughest surveyor of his time. Yet the task of surveying a railway route through the North Island interior was very nearly the end of him. The rugged, bush-clad terrain was only one problem. Worse was the danger from the King Country Maoris, who twice threatened to shoot and bury him on the spot. But in the end, two chiefs guaranteed Rochford safe conduct: the veteran Waikato warrior Rewi Maniapoto and Wahanui, the most powerful chief in the northern King Country. Only under their protection was Rochford able to complete his epic survey. It ended at the confluence of two rivers, the Wanganui and the Ongarue. When Rochford reached there in 1884, Taumaranui was an isolated settlement far removed from the busy Pākehā centres on the coast. But the quiet life didn't last. When Parliament finally approved Rochford's route at the turn of the century, Taumaranui's isolation was destroyed forever. The men who built the railway were Irishmen and Cockneys and South Islanders who'd come north to find work. Conditions for those who work on the line today are easier. Many of the men in the gangs had grandfathers or great-grandfathers who began by opposing Rochford, only later to join the navvies who carved out a line of route with pick and shovel in virgin bush. The faith that Parliament had placed in John Rochford's survey along this line of route appeared to be fully justified. Construction gangs pushed ahead from both ends of the line until in 1898, in this vicinity, and I've just come from National Park, a problem appeared. And it seemed now as if John Rochford's plan had gone seriously, very seriously astray. Rochford had always claimed that his line of route would require gradients of no more than 1 in 70. But between the Waimarino Plateau here and the headwaters of the Wanganui River down there, the best gradients the engineers could find in 1898 were in the order of 1 in 25 or 1 in 17. And in fact, from the spot where I'm standing here to the settlement in the valley down there has in fact a gradient of 1 in 8. A serious mistake had obviously been made by Rochford, and he was no longer around. He died 5 years earlier, in fact, in a hotel alone in Kihi. And unless a solution could be found to this serious problem, the whole main trunk line would be in jeopardy. 20 or 30 years of work would have to be scrapped. The problem was handed over to an engineer, a district engineer in the Public Works Department, and his name was R.W. Holmes. Rochford's mistake was Holmes's big chance, and he grabbed it. The brilliant solution he devised won him a place in the history books and a bright future in the Public Works Department. It became known as the Raurimu Spiral. The principle Holmes followed was a simple one: reduce the gradient by lengthening the line. So the track twists and tunnels under itself to stretch the route from 1 kilometre, as the crow flies, to 4 kilometres of loops and curves and circles. The men with the job of constructing the spiral must have wondered at times which way it was turning next. The irony is that for 3 generations, travellers taking the overnight trip from Wellington to Auckland have crossed this historic section of line without even being aware of the twists and turns their loco was taking. The viaducts flung across deep ravines were the last of the main trunk landmarks to be put into place. They reached across deep gorges cut by rivers tumbling from the flanks of Mount Ruapehu. The most impressive is Maunganui o Te Ao, only a few yards from the spot where the last spike was driven. This plaque marks the spot where the bigwigs assembled and some of the navvies who'd worked on the line on the 6th of November 1908 to watch the Premier, Sir Joseph Ward, officially tie the knot. New Zealand history has few big moments, but the crowds who came to this remote spot in special trains from Auckland and Wellington to watch Sir Joseph surely witnessed one of them. But the real irony is that the first train from Auckland to Wellington had gone through here 3 months earlier, and the Prime Minister was aboard. Not only the Prime Minister, but all his ministers and all the members of both Houses of Parliament, together with their families. They'd gone through northwards to Auckland in August on a somewhat less important mission, a junket, pure and simple. The occasion was the arrival on the Waitemata harbour in Auckland of 16 capital ships of the American battle fleet. The ships were all painted white, and Aucklanders called them the Great White Fleet. Not until the United States Marines took over the city in the 1940s did Aucklanders see anything like it again. The trains that enabled politicians to enjoy this event had enriched the lives of New Zealanders even before there was the North Island main trunk line. After the 1870s, trains gradually took over as chief carriers of both passengers and freight. They hauled coal, fertilizer, livestock. And they took people places, Aucklanders to the spa at Rotorua, Wellingtonians to the beach at Napier, Canterbury supporters to the rugby football match at Dunedin. The progress New Zealand made in the early 1900s is impossible to imagine without railways. But most stations are now desolate, deserted. They already seem to belong to an age that has passed. Where the trains still run, they arrive less frequently, and even then the platforms are often empty. As passengers disappeared, services were cut further and further. The reason for all this is not far away or hard to find. It may be that the railways never did their job properly, but whatever the reason, New Zealanders acquired cars sooner and in greater measure than the people of any country outside North America.
Have you seen her? Ain't she great? She's something you'll appreciate. I'm sure you understand just what I mean. Why, everybody everywhere is falling for her now. I'm talking about the new Ford, and boy, she's sure a wow. Lay off, people, lay off, folks, none of your sarcastic jokes. Henry's made a lady out of Lizzie. Da-da-da-da-da-da, no more bruises, no more aches. Now she's got those four-wheel brakes. Henry's made a lady out of Lizzie.
Close to town, they preferred the lighter English cars, but for the rough roads of the back blocks, there was no beating the big 6- and 8-cylinder models from America. Not even the depression of the 30s stemmed the inflow of new vehicles of every kind. It took the rationing of petrol in World War II to do that. You'd have found driving conditions almost exactly like this if you'd gone any distance at all out of town about the time I came to New Zealand in 1938. The cars were all right. The trouble was the roads and bridges, or the absence of them. I seem to have avoided getting into too much trouble myself, mainly I think because I'd been used to conditions that were rather different, and so these scared me out of my wits, and I very carefully steered around them. But other people weren't either so fortunate or so cautious.
He'd have to get under, get out and get under to fix his little machine. He was just dying to travel his queen, but every minute when he'd begin it.
It's easy enough to smile now, of course, but it wasn't too much fun at that time. In 1938, though, the man who was to acquire for himself the reputation of road and bridge builder in New Zealand was already in office. And he was the sort of man who didn't waste too much time getting started. His name was Bob Semple, a loud-mouthed Minister of Works, who was in his time perhaps the most popular public figure in New Zealand. But at first he was hated. Semple came from Australia in his 20s to work as a coal miner on the west coast. There he became a fiery and frightening agitator, helping to start the Miners' Union and the first Federation of Labour. Later, he earned respect as a hard-working tunneler and contractor. By 1928, he was in Parliament, and when Labour swept to power in 1935, Bob Semple was a natural for Minister of Public Works. Semple had been a navvy himself, and he knew what hard work was. This made it easy for him to see what a difference new mechanized tools could make. The age of the pick and shovel was about to be buried for good. His department became the first to use the bulldozer. Roads had top priority. During Semple's first term of office, money spent on construction increased almost tenfold. There were other newfangled inventions around, among them the idea of using films for political propaganda. Labour and Bob Semple took advantage of them all.
This modern machinery of the Public Works Department is building new roads, new aerodromes, railways, bridges. Here is the burden of toil transferred to the machines that cannot feel it. Just another instance of the common sense use by a Labour minister of the proper plans for a big job.
The Labour government is determined to get rid of these death traps on our highways, hence these overhead bridges.
And so the great Public Works Department, at half the cost and twice the speed, marches on.
Semple became known as Bulldozer Bob, and liked nothing more than the chance to ride in one. Sometimes, though, his enthusiasm ran away with him. When the war came, he backed the idea of what became known as Bob Semple's tank. Public works tractors were converted by adding corrugated armor plating and guns. They weighed 25 tons and were far too heavy for most of Semple's own bridges. The army tried them for a year, but then gave up, and Semple was asked to take them back. To me and to most people, Bob Semple's legacies are the roads and bridges that were built during his term of office and soon afterwards, using the heavy gear and newfangled machinery that he introduced to the country. And that's because, after the war, many families, including my own, got cars for the first time. And now we could visit parts of the country we hadn't had a chance of visiting before. And the roads provided access to the spectacular scenery and natural landmarks that New Zealanders until then had seen only in journals like the New Zealand Freelance, the Auckland Weekly News, and the various pictorial annuals that they sent to their relatives and friends overseas at Christmas time. But roads and the land they opened up are only part of Bob Semple's legacy. As the network of tar-sealed roads unfolded after the war, New Zealand was also building another main trunk system, a national grid of transmission lines hoisted high. No road or railway ever reached as far or followed so straight a line. Only aircraft show more disdain for the shape of the land below. They too took off after the war. Trained pilots and technicians returned to fly their native skies, and soon it became clear that here was a potential main trunk line that would soar above the physical obstacles that earlier generations had struggled against. The main problem was finding places to land. Even flat land by itself was not enough. At Ardmore, which has more takeoffs and landings than any other airstrip in New Zealand, the tarmac rests in part on peat, and hills hem it in. It remains unsuitable for heavy aircraft. The airports which do accommodate the big jets, whether civil or military, have had to be built by man, often from scratch and always at great expense. These airports represent most graphically the way New Zealanders in a century and a half have imposed their stamp upon a difficult terrain. Here, it seems, technology has triumphed. But no triumph over land or sea is complete when the weather closes in. Many times a year, high winds and low clouds in Cook Strait mean a rough ride for passengers travelling through Wellington. A really bad spell of weather here, and transport throughout the country can be disrupted for days. More than any other junction, the capital shows how vulnerable New Zealand's main trunk line still is when nature runs out of control.